session of the afternoon. George is going to speak about this paper about whether getting the Olympics in your town would make you happy. And so George will speak for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have discussion. We end at 5:30. You just said 7:15 for the bus.
Yeah, so
right?
we end at 5:30.
Don't end at 7:15.
Surely won't.
7:14.
Yeah, not exactly.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Matt, for having me. I'm seriously jet lagged. I just arrived last night, and I'm 5 hours ahead, actually. So I don't plan to keep you that long myself, actually. So let me talk about this study a bit more. So this is, excuse me, a study through a large grant that was awarded to us from the main social science research bodies in UK, France, and Germany. And what we're doing is we're collecting primary data, and we're kind of constructing our own panel, so the same individual over time. In London, Paris, and Berlin, the idea is to capture the intangible benefits of hosting the Olympics that occurred in the summer of 2012. So we're serving individuals a year before, 2011, again the same period over the summer, over July, August, 2012, and then 2013 to capture the legacy effects. So the third wave of our survey will occur actually in a couple of months. We include in these questions the 4 subjective well-being questions that the Office for National Statistics in the UK has recently included in their national surveys. So these are one question of an evaluative question, a typical life satisfaction one, 2 questions on experience, subjective well-being, one on happiness yesterday and the other one on anxiety yesterday. And the third question, kind of a eudaimonic, about worthwhile. The Office for National Statistics is like the main statistical agency in the UK and has started collecting these data from April 2011. So that's something like, I suppose, the Census Bureau here or something like that, collecting this data. Not only subject well-being, what other stuff we're measuring is behavioral change. So whether because of the Olympics you'll be more physically active, eat more healthy, whether your BMI will decrease because of that healthiness and activity related, and all of this sort. So this is our sample so far. The first wave, about 7.5 individuals in London and Paris, about 5,000 in Berlin, and we do online and telephone surveys. And then the same individuals, we don't cross the mode. So whoever was online keeps going online. Whoever was on telephone is again contacted through the telephone. Pretty good response rates, given that these surveys are a year apart, so it's more than 50%. Paris is keen to participate in our surveys. Of course, well, I shouldn't say this since we're recording this, but these people don't know that this survey is about the Olympics. Right. So there's no kind of focusing effect related to the Olympics. Right. Okay. Order effects. Now, there wasn't a simple way to put this graph. Of course, we know in all surveys, as already mentioned before, that the order of the question matters. So the tendency is to include the subjective well-being question first, rather than asking you about your age and then asking you how happy you are, so priming you like, you're old or you're young, so that affects your score. But there's, to the best of our knowledge, there's no evidence of the order of subjective well-being questions themselves. So these 4 questions appear in the beginning of the survey, and what we did in all 3 cities in the first wave was to randomize the order of the happiness and anxiety question. So the blue is the happiness. When happiness is asked first, you give another score for anxiety. Notice that higher scores are better for life satisfaction, happiness, and worthwhile, but lower score is better for anxiety because it's like, how anxious are you yesterday? 0, not at all, and 10, very much so. So lower score is better. However, the minute we revert the order and we ask anxiety first, right? This tends to be higher than when it's asked second, and it also pulls down the happiness score you give. Now, yeah, this kind of 0.3 difference between the blue column might seem very small, but on a 0 to 10 scale is very substantive, and I'll give contextual estimates in a minute. However, the important thing to see is that the worthwhile question which is asked last is not affected by order. So these differences on happiness and anxiety are statistically significant at the 1% level, but worthwhile is unaffected in our survey. This difference persists both online and on the telephone, right? And what you see is actually, and will be the topic in the next few slides, that the telephone scores are higher in general. So on average 7 in all 3 cities, here's about 6.6, say, and so on. So what I'm going to present next is a series of similar kind of randomizations and experiments. We just couldn't resist the opportunity to perform some experiments in all these cities. At some point we might have overdone it a bit, complicating our subsequent analysis that we'll start doing. So mood effects. This is from our first wave only, just for illustration. We have the 4 measures here. The telephone.
Where was life satisfaction on the other slides?
It's always first, so I didn't include it. Doesn't matter. It goes into the mode, just because of that. So telephone, the dark blue column, always higher, and for anxiety, always lower. Unconditional mean, that's about a 0.5 point difference on a 0 to 10 scale, so that's pretty huge. Now, of course, on our survey, there is a selection effect, especially for the online participants. You get the email, but when do you self-select to reply and do the survey? You might reply to it when you're feeling very sad or very happy. So there are a number of issues there. So at the same time when we were doing this preliminary analysis, the official UK ONS data were released from April 2011 to March 2012, 1 entire year. We did a preliminary study with Paul Dolan on this on the very first 6 months of this data. This is a Center for Economics performance paper at the LSE, but it has some disadvantages because we couldn't distinguish some issues of self-selection between modes in every wave you participate. This is an updated study now, and this is the one that's uploaded on the site for the conference. Otherwise, I'm happy to email you the most current one on the entire 12 months. So the ONS is doing face-to-face and telephone rather than online and telephone. But again, the same pattern persists. Telephone is always higher. And all these differences are statistically significant, of course. Now you might again say that, what's a 0.4 difference or 0.5, right? Unconditional mean, once we do the regressions and control for all the demographics, the coefficient on the telephone is about 0.2. And this 0.2 is very substantial. In the ONS section, the right column, for example, life satisfaction is twice as large as the coefficient of being a male. So it's kind of that big. For worthwhile, it offsets 2/3 of the negative effect of being a male. And it's as large as being self-employed, 1/3 of unemployment, and so on. For happiness, it offsets half of the effect of widowhood, etc. And we find the important difference, of course, for our survey, which is comparing online to telephone. So for worthwhile, the coefficient of telephone is 5 times greater than having a university degree, for example. So this 0.2 difference on a 0 to 10 scale is very, very substantive once you put it in context in relation to the other coefficients in a regression model. Now, why is this important? Well, for national surveys it is, for the case of the ONS. Well, for 2 reasons. One, a sort of sloppy analysis, if I'm allowed the words. So there are already some preliminary analysis of the same data by ONS themselves, by other think tanks in the UK, disregarding mode and just presenting averages. Right? So over time, as we gather more and more of the same data, we have a flawed picture of how average athletic well-being in the UK is, or is doing. More importantly, there are regions in the UK which are interviewed through one mode only. So when you're doing cross-regional comparisons, mode effects should be taken into consideration. And the general implications for this are quite big in the sense that in a more macro scale, if we take the Gallup poll data, Gallup is also using dual mode, telephone and face-to-face interviews. And you get the face-to-face in less developed nations and the telephone in the more developed ones. And in some cases, you have a dual mode as well. So presumably, that's up for further analysis. You might find a different slope on the happiness-income kind of relationship, kind of the Einstein paradox, controlling for mode. Framing effects. So here's where we might have just overdone it a bit with our randomizations. Following the four main ONS questions that actually Paul Dolan, together with Richard Layout and Robert Metcalf, proposed to the ONS, there was a big discussion of the wording. So we took the opportunity to experience a little bit with that ourselves. So in the wave one of our survey, we randomized for London only, where it matters for policy purposes, anxious yesterday with worried yesterday, to see whether it makes any difference. As you can see, there are similar distributions, and in fact, there's no statistically difference between the two measures. Then in wave two, for all three cities, we experimented between asking happiness yesterday and happiness now. Again, the purpose for that resulted from feedback from people that participated in the ONS surveys, like they didn't really understand the term yesterday. Why were you asking me about my happiness yesterday? It was strange for them, so there was some consideration of just asking about your happiness now. So we experimented again with that. Again, similar distributions. The mean is about 6.54, 6.51. No statistically difference between the two distributions. However, when doing the anxiety yesterday versus anxiety now, you find actually differences, and you get less anxiety yesterday. This is a distribution jointly for all three cities, but this independently stands for each city individually. Okay. Wave two then, we also randomized anxiety with stress. And again, we have differences in the distribution. This is more concentrated towards the mean. This is kind of more spread. And again, this difference, 4.93 to 4.62, is statistically significant. You're less stressed yesterday than you are now. And again, anxious vs stressed, similar as in wave one, we had anxious vs worried. Again, you're less anxious than you are stressed yesterday. And the other combination that's left is to compare anxious now and stressed now, where again there are differences, and you are less anxious than stressed now. Finally, a randomization between worthwhile and purpose. How purposeful do you find the things that you do in your life? Here again we find similar distributions, just as the case with anxiety and worry, and the case with happiness yesterday and happiness now. The only difference where we find this not to hold is for the UK only. So in with UK, when I say UK, I mean London and Paris for France. So Paris and Berlin, there's no difference between the distributions when we use alternate words of these terms. Yes.
What were the translations?
I don't remember them. But we are a big team of, well, economists nonetheless, from all three cities. So we made sure that we double-checked the translation that the survey company offered. Yeah?
Can I ask clarification? You keep comparing distributions, but why do we care about the distributions? Don't we care about what you showed before? What would coefficients look like?
Oh yes, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, this is preliminary analysis in the sense that the wave 2, which are most of these framing effects from anxious stress, etc., is literally very, very fresh data. We just got hold of like a month ago, and in fact, there's been some coding errors in the control variables for which I couldn't run any regressions.
But in principle, it could be that the distributions are different, but still you would get exactly the same data.
Yes. Of course.
Okay.
You might get different determinants with the same distribution, for example. That's your point?
The opposite. It could be that the distributions are different, but it doesn't matter which question you ask, today or yesterday, or anxiety or worry, they will have exactly the same correlates and would move over time exactly the same way, right? So in a way, we don't care about the distribution. We want to know
Yes.
the information content if it's different.
Yeah.
Isn't that just to say that the coefficient in the OS is limited information? In theory, you'd like a distribution. It's just that normally you don't pick that up with a coefficient.
Well, so you'll have to convince me that there is a use for which I'll care about the distribution specifically. So OLS is only one use, but you could just track it over time, right? Or you could track it across, I don't know what's the use, but it's not clear to me that, so I'll give you an example. Let's say the distribution is shifted by 1. So, worry, you get some bell from 1 to 9. And anxiety, you get exactly the same bell from 9 to 10. It's just worry plus 1.
Right.
Then the distributions will fail all the tests. They will be different. But I don't care which question you ask. It has exactly the same informational content.
Well, the additional question is the coefficients is picking up the average, right?
Yeah.
For the average effect on, or correlation with the distribution versus it might be very different in different parts of the distribution.
Well, for the ordered model, it wouldn't. For the ordered, it will be the same. For the OLS, yes, it will capture the average.
All I'm saying is that it could be that one distribution is a one-to-one, there is a one-to-one function. So it could be some transformation from one to the other, which is stable, and then I don't care if they're different.
Yeah, and that's still to be shown with this data.
If it were bimodal, you'd be interested.
Not even. If I could map the distribution 1 to distribution 2 in a stable transformation.
Just to say that all of these framing comparisons were made online and not on the telephone. So we decided then to keep the telephone as clean as possible to be able, in the end of the day, to do a proper analysis without controlling for a series of dummy variables and being left with very few cases of things that hold. So all these lie in the empirical domain of how should you frame the question, how the order of all these subjective well-being questions might affect one another, and mode effects, which are actually quite interesting. And it raises more questions than it proposes as solutions, right? It just leaves it at the open that the context of what you ask, how you ask it, and the way you administer the survey matters. Things change once you change the question, so the main thing is basically to keep it consistent, especially in a panel of individuals. So that's probably the main conclusion out of this, rather than suggesting what's the optimal question or anything like that.
Do you have before you go to the Olympics, since people are sort of jumping in anyway, do you have a sense of why, I mean, you could say, okay, telephone would come up higher than the internet because people are, don't want to admit to being unhappy, versus on the internet that they're anonymous, they're totally anonymous. But then face-to-face, you would think then would go but face-to-face goes the other way. So what is it about telephone? It's almost like telephone is standing out as the anomaly. Because
mean-
why is it higher on the why is it higher on the phone than either of these other two, which should run, telephone should be in the middle?
Totally agree. So once we compare the face-to-face with the telephone, I mean, we had the same kind of curiosity. If results are driven by social desirability bias, then the closer the interviewer is, the more positive your response should be. So higher responses should, in principle, be face-to-face responses. Yet we see people being happier on the phone. Overall, by happiness, I mean all subject will be measures. So we can't offer any prescription of why this occurs. Only speculation. And our strongest speculation is that you cannot lie face-to-face. So in a face-to-face interview, if you look miserable, you cannot lie and say that you're very happy. Whereas you can easily lie on the phone if you don't want to admit, to your misery, say, broadly speaking. But that's, again, just speculation. I mean, the face-to-face interview being driven by the social desirability bias has been shown before by Conte and Pandey in the Restat paper they did on the British Household Panel Survey, where there is a section for self-completion and face-to-face interviews. So they find bigger responses, more positive responses for job satisfaction on the face-to-face one, and it's what they call put on a good show for the interviewer. So an interviewer comes to your place, to your home, so you kind of put a good show for him.
Is there any issue of selection effects? I mean, is it possible that people who reply to a telephone interview are people who are more comfortable on the telephone, or that's been ruled out?
No, it might as well.
Because I mean, it's possible that if the people who are comfortable with the telephone are people who don't use the internet, and who've not, I mean, if it's true that using the internet tends to depress your happiness, I mean, so I would wonder about selection effects, particularly given the size of the effect, which is huge. I would really want to rule out selection effects, as between people who like the phone and people who don't like the phone.
I would worry for selection effects comparing our survey, which is online and telephone, for that exact purpose. But on the face-to-face with the telephone, which is supposed to be a representative sample of the UK population, it's much more complicated than that.
Are there people who just refuse to pick up the phone, is my question. How do you rule out that possibility?
That we don't have data on that. We don't have data on non-response.
I think that's important.
Or on how many attempts were made until you picked up the phone, which is a study.
I want to get off the phone. It's the tendency.
That's
Abram in his paper talked about I'm fine response to a lot of questions. All your kids when they're away at college, they'll say I'm fine. They come home, gotta go, right? Come home, Daddy, I'm tired. They talk more things.
That's very true. That would be my second point. That the presence of the interviewer is there to explain questions that might be difficult, to motivate you, to drive your attention towards what the question is. Whereas in the telephone, you might as well just answer. You're doing other things. You might be multitasking in the same time, so we don't know what's going on the telephone.
That's what I was going to ask, is how much time and concentration does each of them take? So with the online and the in-person, you might have to devote more of your attention to it, whereas on the phone, you could be doing something else too. People may feel less interrupted by the telephone.
Yeah. All these are things that we don't know, because the ONS data is, of course, secondary data, so we don't have much information about what goes on there. We also, in our Olympics data, I mean, we're doing all sorts of experiments, as I mentioned, which I didn't offer here. We're also doing an impact of the gender of the interviewer on your response on the telephone. We don't find much on our sample. However, it would have been interesting to test that in the ONS sample, for which we don't have data. So all these are possibilities, and all these might be true for different regions as well, because we're talking about an entire country. However, as it stands, the most cost-effective way to increase subjective well-being in the UK is just to call everybody, rather than do any face-to-face interviews. Finally, back to the main topic, which is, and this will be my last slide, literally, on data we just recently got, by the way. The Olympics effect. As I mentioned, there's one more wave to follow. However, just graphing the averages, life satisfaction, happiness, anxiety, and worthwhile. The blue is the UK, red is France, green is Germany. So for life satisfaction and happiness, we see that the slope, if you wish, for the UK is much steeper than the other two countries. Right. Whereas there is not much difference for anxiety and worthwhile. And in a very kind of crude regression without controlling for any personal characteristics for which we have many coding errors there that the survey company has to resolve, this increase is about 0.2. So it's again pretty large, assuming all other coefficients on gender will be about 0.10, 0.15. Unemployment is usually about 0.4, more or less, in a noise regression. So a 0.2 increase, assuming it doesn't fall substantially after controlling for all the other demographics, will be quite substantial.
What's the timing on these interviews related to the Olympics?
So, by the way, this is only telephone. So one mode, and the telephone interviews in 2012 occurred during the Olympics period, so from the 27th of July until the 12th of August. So it was during the Olympics. There is, of course, much more to be done with this, include the medals for each of these countries. Not only include medals, but the deviation from expected medals, because otherwise you might have discounted this information. Is it overachievement or underachievement that made you happier, more or less satisfied, etc.? And of course, then for London, geocode the data because we have postcode, and get the distance, happiness in terms of distance, say from the main Olympic village or something like that, to see whether you get a spatial difference in London. The further away you are, maybe the less happier you are. That's an empirical assumption again.
Do you have any way of coding whether the people in London were making money off the Olympics?
No. You mean by renting their homes or something? Yes. No. One reason being that we didn't want to ask any Olympic-specific questions, but even if we had, I doubt we would have thought of that. Yeah.
Two further thoughts there. One is with the medals and the geocoding, you could also code for the hometown of the athlete. So,
But it will be, this is London data only, and the hometown of
oh
the
yeah, so
athlete
you don't have that.
is
That would be
national.
nice if you had from the national team has athletes from all over the country, and when they win a medal, their town might be much happier than the other towns in the same country.
Yeah. I guess
that
with
would
the
be
ONS data, once it releases the second wave, which will be from April 2012 forwards, that will cover the Olympics period, will be nationwide, we'll be able to do some
Yeah.
sort of analysis.
Other question I was going to ask was, you didn't do this survey at the time that it was announced which city would host the
No.
Olympics. Because I was living in Paris at the time that London won the 2012 Olympics, and I would think that would be an interesting period to test also. The excitement and anticipation in the winning country and the disappointment to see if it shows up.
That's very true,
Yeah.
because, I mean, in principle, a difference in difference, so difference in happiness in the treatment group, which is the UK, versus the control, which is Germany. So, by the way, the reason why we chose London, Paris, and Berlin is not accidental. Paris was the favorite to win and missed out. London won unexpectedly. And Berlin is a clean control because they didn't even bid to start with. So Berlin is kind of a reference point, and the other two compared to Berlin. A proper analysis would require the before the Olympics period to be unannounced. Whereas here, the Olympics were given to London in July 2005, a day before the London bombings. Interesting to say that I just found out there was a tourist attack in London today. I haven't heard much. Supposedly it was small, but nonetheless. Now that drew my attention away from the Olympics. Sorry, what was that?
Take another question.
Right. So yeah, it might already be discounted. That was my point. From 2005 up to 2011 that we did this might be discounted. But again, we didn't have, of course, the resources to anticipate that. That would have been the perfect experiment, but it can be analyzed from secondary data. Secondary data so far show that there is a happiness impact from hosting, but not from performance. So your medals, actual or deviation from predicted medals, don't matter at all. But hosting does. But the effect is short-lived. That's what previous evidence shows.
But there are two effects of hosting, right? One is just the financial effect of, you got all the hotel rooms, you're making money, renting out your room, and all that. And the other is the kind of pride your country's done. Is there any way to separate out those two?
We have a question on, excuse me, we have a, sorry. We have a question on national pride, which we haven't looked at as well for the time being. For national pride, previous evidence shows that hosting matters again, but performance also does. That was for soccer, not for medals. So winning the cup does matter for national pride. So it would be interesting to see whether we find maybe an effect on pride and not on the subject will be.
It's a little different for the Olympics because there's not a single win.
That's true. That's true. Although, well, thankfully, London, well, the UK did unexpectedly well.
Yeah.
So maybe that will show up. If it doesn't, it will be an even stronger point that performance doesn't matter because it was so unexpectedly a good performance.
You asked a question like have you asked a question like how proud do you feel about your country? That might tip off the Olympics, but if you asked a pride question and then looked at, what that correlated with the happiness mood, that would be interesting.
And just to say that now that's our final wave, towards the end of the survey, we will ask Olympic-specific questions.
Right.
So that way we'll be able kind of to, take you a year back and, tell us how happy were you about hosting the Olympics.
Yeah.
Focusing effect there, but at least it will be interesting to see any.
The other way you might be able to separate them out is, I don't know if you have enough data, but you said you gathered it during the Olympics, but that's a period. So as they're winning more and more medals, you should expect it to go up, whereas if it's just national pride of hosting, right, then that wouldn't be affected.
That's something in the process of what we'll be doing. Our online survey goes up to the end of September, so we might as well capture immediate legacy effects, so showing like an adaptation, a bell curve, and then compare it again to 2013, a year afterwards. Generally speaking, the entire motivation of this study is that, as it might be well known in the US, from franchises and the economic impact of stadiums, etc., that this have zero impact, if not negative, on economic growth, on tourism, on employment, wages. All the tangible impacts are literally zero. But we find an effect just recently, from 2010 onwards, that studies on this kind of area with sporting events and subject well-being have started. There is an effect on hosting, and then get kind of the monetized compensation, kind of value the Olympics in terms of a happiness income. So how much more income do I have to give you, to compensate you for not hosting the Olympics, and then give a value of the games. Yeah.
This is amazing data that you've collected, very impressive.
Thanks.
Across all these different countries and all these different variations of the survey, and it's interesting to see what the effects of the different survey variations are. I'm wondering though that, for policy purposes, what we want to know, I think, is which version of this should we ask? Should we ask about anxiety before happiness, or vice versa? Should we do it by telephone or face-to-face? How are you thinking about what the criterion is or benchmark for judging which of these which of the answers you're getting is the right answer for policy purposes.
Yeah. Again, as mentioned, I support the view that we should have three broad dimensions of subjective well-being in all these surveys. So an evaluative, an experienced, with one positive or one negative, and a worthwhile question. I wouldn't say I'm a strong, personally, I'm not a strong supporter of asking happiness and anxiety yesterday, although I see the reason why these were termed as such. And strictly speaking, there is no right or wrong order of these questions, but this is just to show that whichever order is picked, it should stay consistently the same. But there are no prescriptions of, ask happiness, then anxiety, then worthwhile, then life satisfaction, or, the other way around. Just to say that the minute you flip, one might affect the other. Because there's kind of an anchoring effect, the same as, think of the last digit of your national security number, and now tell me how happy you are, and, this number will kind of anchor to your response. So it was the same with the asking happiness and anxiety first. The minute you ask anxiety first, this drives down your rate of happiness, whereas asking happiness first, this drives up anxiety, you're more anxious. And the minute you ask happiness first, this drives down, you're less anxious, your anxiety. So this kind of anchoring going on there.
The psychologists that are involved in this on sort of the policy front are adamant that, that you have to have evaluation, but as you say, a negative and a positive affect or experience question, because they can so you can have high evaluative well-being and high stress or whatever at the same time, and that they're not a continuum, even though it would be convenient if they were. And then there's a lot of I'm interested in your worthwhile findings, which move the least. I'm personally really interested in this sort of eudaimonic dimension, and I think there's a lot of interest in it, but I think that a lot of people, if you probably would agree, say that's the dimension we just know the least about. In terms of how those measures track.
Absolutely. Worthwhile measures, I don't think they exist in any secondary data, other than the ONS data now, for which we have some determinants. They only exist in day reconstruction methods data, like a breakdown of your episode the previous day, and then measures of effect and purpose, 6 questions there about each kind of episode. So, as Dan, he left. No, you're there. You just moved places. So as you mentioned, the study by Knabe, 2010, the Economic Journal, where unemployed individuals are still less satisfied than the employed, the usual finding. But in terms of time use, they find more worthwhile because in their free time they do more pleasurable activities. So there's kind of this trade-off between worthwhile and happiness. Yeah.
So what I'm wondering, kind of tying Dan's question to Ori's, is if you were to test for an interaction between the Olympics and then the order framing or mode effects, you could find something really interesting along the lines of what Ori was talking about, because if in fact the way you ask the question changes those relationships, that's a really important thing for us to know.
Yeah, of course.
Do you have this data also with the online survey? Did people give survey responses during that time period?
Yes.
Face to face, can you look to see if the mode changes not just the main effect, but also the slopes of the lines? Is there an interaction there? Because that might tell us the right way to ask a question in future studies, depending on the exact nature of the study that we're trying to do, right?
I don't think the answer to that would be a prescription of the right way to answer the question, but I do agree that it will be interesting to find differences in the valuation, if you wish, of the Olympics using the subjective well-being approach, depending on how you frame the question. That would be interesting to show, but irrespective of the results, I don't think this will put it anything like in hardwired terms, that you should ask it that way and in prescriptive terms. Just to say that our online survey occurs for the second wave about a week before the Olympics, from the 20th of July, and goes up to the 30th of September. So a more wide kind of interval, whereas the telephone is constrained only during the actual Olympics. So the online covers the Paralympics as well, which is also very important for the UK in terms of sports, because they're trying to promote a lot the Paralympics.
I understand that from kind of an intrinsic value perspective, that the different phrasings are kind of, there's no a priori reason to choose one over the other. But to the degree that they do affect the responses and mean that you can't compare one thing to another, I'm trying to work with municipalities that are independent actors. And do you have any suggestions about how you might approach the question of standardization? How you might decide which of these, even if arbitrarily, has to be the right way to do it, or at least the accepted way to do it?
This hasn't occurred to me before, to be honest. I don't have an immediate answer. It's tricky, though, because the way you interpret the question differs, right? So, I mean, to standardize it, you can standardize the response scale and normalize it, right? Or transform it from 0 to 7 to 0 to 10. But a normalization based on different questions, I don't think it's possible. It will be, flawed, from the beginning. Assuming that, the response scale you can change. Making assumptions about normalizing the question per se, I think that would be very hard to justify.
I was just very interested in the fact that life satisfaction and happiness go up significantly in the UK, and compared to France and Germany, but that anxiety behaves just the same way. And I imagine, I don't know, worthwhileness I don't know much about as a measure. And I was thinking one of the challenges is to try to think of an explanation of the top two that wouldn't also predict a difference on anxiety. So, you could imagine that having positive things happen in your country and having attention to your country, and a lot of those things might lessen certain types of anxiety more than just your average time. And I was just wondering, is anything known about how it changes what information people receive in the course of a day if they're hosting versus not hosting the Olympics? What happens to what gets reported to them? How much of the news is affected? How do people get that information? Are they, in other words, you could imagine that one thing that's going on is it's shifting the kind of information that they're getting on a daily basis as well, to be hosting as opposed to just, and that's something you could also study, because you could do an analysis of, you could just go back and look at the newspapers, the radio programs, or something like that, and I was just thinking you might find some effect there.
What we're actually doing, well, we're supposed to get in touch with people to get data on that, is broadcasting times in each of the three cities. Presumably the big events like the FIFA World Cup or the Olympics are broadcasted in Freeview TV, so everybody can watch them. But the amount of time that this occurs might differ. So we want to see exactly, that would be kind of capturing the news, how much.
And also, does it drive other kinds of things off the news?
Yeah.
So there's certain things people aren't hearing that they would be hearing if they were in.
Now, about anxiety, I mean, you're right. Just looking at this graph and without having done any analysis whatsoever, it is a bit surprising that you see an effect was going to look like an effect on happiness and life satisfaction, but not on anxiety, because generally speaking, from the first wave of a survey where we just did some simple analysis of the demographics, we do find that the things that tend to positively predict happiness, relax the causal assumptions for the time being, are the ones that, decrease your anxiety, which makes sense. Like anxiety should more or less be kind of the opposite to happiness. But we don't see this effect here for the Olympics. Having just spoken about terrorist attacks, it might just be that. It might be that although the Olympics at the same time would in principle decrease your level of anxiety as it raises your happiness, there is some anxiety about adverse effect because of the Olympics. Maybe a terrorist attack might occur, so I'm more careful.
Maybe more news items about security.
Yeah,
Could be that
traffic congestion.
more anxious people just don't respond as much to
Yeah,
this.
that might also
No,
be
I mean,
true.
you know,
Yeah, that's, yeah.
I mean, all this
It
is
might
again
be.
speculative, right? It's,
You know,
right.
we did some stuff on the Gallup Daily poll and looking at people who had reported depression, didn't respond to the events of the crisis at all, the financial crisis.
Yeah.
It's almost, they
Interesting.
were already low, so they
Yeah.
stayed low. Maybe if you're already anxious, you
Yeah. Of
stay
course,
anxious.
anxiety did go down.
yeah.
The other potential effect, just to put in this list of items that might explain why anxiety didn't get affected by happiness, is that, as I recall, there was a lot of anxiety about traffic in London,
Oh.
right? And that, people were worried about being able to get from one side to the other and stuff like that, and that might have affected this.
Yeah, that was the first thing I thought of. So you mean that people were happy about the Olympics and lived there?
And then there was also, this might have been before
I left
2011, but there was a
London
wave
before
of
it started. It was so weird.
news media reporting about people concerned about the British military posting missile batteries on the tops of civilian apartment
Right.
buildings.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
So you might have to have a longer time series to, if there were an uptick in anxiety about that.
Yeah.
But what's dramatic here is that as compared to these other cities, there's no difference at all.
Yeah.
So, I mean, all these stories say, well, there's a double effect where it reduces anxiety of other things, but that would not tend to predict a perfect matching on the time frame of anxiety in other cities, right? And
It'd be
this
surprising.
looks like, get through the rest, but it looks like the coefficient on the Olympics with respect to anxiety is 0. And that's pretty surprising.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's still,
But even though it affects life satisfaction, well-being, yeah.
Yeah.
it's still surprising.
So I wonder if the happiness question, it's asking specifically about feeling happy, which on any affect-based theory of happiness is going to be one component of happiness along with, say, anxiety. So, and I wonder if people are interpreting it more as a general happiness question. It's certainly a worry in terms of the way the public consumes the data, but in looking at the way the lines behave and the order effects, that seems like a worry. I don't know how you fix it. Just on the question, the response, the administration mode effects, do the internet responses cluster with the face-to-face or with the phone interview in terms of being higher or lower? I don't recall.
So these are two different surveys. One is our primary data collection, which is online and telephone, and the other one is separate. Is the one the UK government runs for face-to-face and telephone. We have nothing to do with that one, right?
Well, it's just because on the phone, one possibility is if anxiety is higher but the positives are more positive, maybe people are just more emphatic on the phone emotionally. Like you could to deal with the fact that you're not face-to-face, or they're just more willing to give more extreme responses to kind of anything.
The extreme responses is indeed another possibility, kind of polarization towards the extremes, and I believe there is evidence, and we also found for the ONS data that 25% of those with the least education give a 10 out of 10 score on life satisfaction, for example, on the phone. Which might be again an indication that it's just very hard to interpret. So I just give you the maximum, and all this of course needs ongoing research. Of course, I mean this is just a glimpse. As I mentioned, we've got all sorts of things going on here. Big analysis. Thankfully, we're a big team, so we haven't analyzed any of the behaviors yet. We have a very short DRM measure inside there as well. We have hyperbolic discounting questions to see whether people discount the future a lot, so that will have an impact on the 2013 data, our final data, to see whether we find any significant legacy effects. And maybe we don't find legacy in terms of happiness or subjective well-being in general, but maybe we do for behaviors, for physical activity and so on. So there we will conclude that the literature on sports events shows no significant impact on tangible benefits or tangible outcomes in general, but it does on physical promotion or promotion of health. In which case, then you can do a cost-benefit analysis and say, how much does a campaign to combat obesity costs compared to hosting the Olympics? Right, that can be an open question.
We're 5:30?
Okay,
Thank
you very much.
Thank you, George.
thank you.